Today we have a pretty exciting masterpiece from the time of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, thereabouts, the publishing of that novel, about 190 years ago, with this museum-quality chair signed by one of the great names of French furniture history, especially in terms of chairs, the Jeanselme family of master furniture makers, official furnishers to the courts of King Louis-Philippe, and later Emperor Napoleon III. Now, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we're actually going to find a different iteration of this very same rosewood chair, also signed by Jeanselme, but which is a little bit less ornate than this one. It relies almost entirely on sculpture for the decor. Here we have a few more complicated devices such as inlays, and stylistically this one mixes a little bit of the Neo-Renaissance style that's emerging, whereas the Met Museum's one is purely Gothic. Nevertheless, that helps establish that regardless of me pilfering this object, it is kind of objectively relevant for us to study and look at. It's actually an astonishingly interesting example of furniture from this under-researched, unusual transitional period of about 1840. Which is the cutoff for normal traditional European decorative art. After that, we are in the industrial era. Before that, we're in the traditional timeline. So what an interesting piece on the crux of two different paradigms. Incidentally, the Metropolitan Museum's chair is the image for Wikipedia, which is representing the work of this firm today, if you were to Google Jeanselme. Also, please do subscribe to the channel if you would like to help in the creation of this online library and promote awareness of the difference between pre-industrial works of art and general antiques. Now anyway, Jeanselme was to the period of about 1830 to 1900 what the Jacob family dynasty of master furniture makers was to the period of 1770 to 1840. And this is true not only by virtue of the importance of Jeanselme's work, steeped in royal and imperial tradition, as the 1998 Winter Bulletin of the Metropolitan Museum states, but also because the Jeanselme firm literally purchased the Jacob firm in 1847. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Jacob, this is one of the greatest names in art furniture history. It's also, like the Jeanselme, a three-generation dynasty. Here is a piece of Jacob furniture for Marie Antoinette. We might as well take a look at an iconic one made during the time of Napoleon. And then here's one from 1826 in the Royal Collection Trust, made for the King of England. And then also here is a book stand in the Metropolitan Museum made by the last Jacob for the eldest son of King Louis-Philippe, who later appointed this firm to be official furnisher. Anyway, the last Jacob is buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery along with all sorts of other famous people like Benjamin Franklin's son. So, relative to Jacob, Jeanselme's seeming lack of equivalent celebrity is due probably only to the lesser amount of attention which has been given to Jeanselme's later period of operation, primarily 1830 to 1900, although the firm continued until it closed in 1930. So the French term troubadour is going to help us more specifically designate something like this, which did not seek to academically revive the Gothic or to copy original Gothic styles, but which rather intended to whimsically and romantically repropose a very idealized and totally imaginary Renaissance and late medieval atmosphere. So in addition to the very romantic, nostalgic, and historically incorrect aspect that Troubadour is going to evoke, Troubadour also hones in on an early French facet of Gothic revival, which actually emerges in the 1750s in England, and then it continues well up into the 20th century. So Troubadour is generally from about 1820 to 1850, and it is French. But generally, the bulk of Gothic revival pieces are going to be from the final third of the 19th century, about 50 years after this was made, and they're going to be rather faithful reproductions in solid oak or walnut, late medieval period woods, They're not going to be Brazilian rosewood, wacky interpretations and reinventions that are somehow inspired by the Gothic but have absolutely nothing to do with anything that ever existed during the late Gothic period. That, on the other hand, is Troubadour. And there are other Troubadour objects in this room, such as the fascinating mantel clock underneath the glass case, which is not its original case, but nevertheless, it's kind of cool. That is a clock that never would have existed during the Gothic period when they, of course, couldn't make something so wonderful. Anyway, it's actually probably predating this chair. It's a little bit less eclectic and bizarre than this chair. It's earlier. It's more pure, if we want to get into any aesthetic judgment. But both of these objects are from the French Troubadour period. Very convenient to have that clock for this video. Although someone purchased it, and I'm not sure that I'm richer for having sold it. And even if it is associated with 1820 to 1850, the Troubadour movement's origins can be traced to the French Revolution, when the revolutionaries were exhuming the bodies, the remains of all of these old kings, and presenting to the public, sometimes selling, a lot of medieval artifacts, thereby exposing the public once again to that aesthetic, which had been buried for a long time. Also in 1802, the French literary giant Chateaubriand publishes The Genius of Christianity, which had an impact on the arts, namely paintings. Why don't we take a look at a Troubadour painting? Okay, so Troubadour is bubbling up from these things. And then when we reach the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy post-Napoleon, well after the fall of the old regime, of course Troubadour is going to take off because it is looking back nostalgically to the time of lords and ladies. So it's as if the newly restored Bourbon monarchy was trying to forget the carnage of the Napoleonic Wars and the Revolution and look back to when the lords and ladies had full control of everything and we just rode around jousting all the time. You can see why the Bourbon monarchy would have had this particular brand of nostalgia for the old Catholic aristocracy of the late Gothic period. After the fall of the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in 1830, we get to 1831, the publishing of Victor Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris, and we see that the Troubadour movement is by no means disappearing, it's really just continuing. And then later on in the 19th century, of course, people are still romanticizing the Gothic with more pure and academic Gothic revivals, the beautiful work of architect Viollet-le-Duc in his restoration of Notre Dame. But anyway, I wanted to just sort of paint the picture, give you all a little bit of context before we go ahead and take a closer look at it. It should be said, though, that here in the 1830s, they were making some very true, pure Gothic revival copies with a higher amount of historic accuracy, a lower amount of fantasy and whimsy. I can show you an example of pieces like that now, which will be covered in another video. Make no mistake, this is just the beginning of a change in the channel. I will be sharing with you my insane collection of Gothic revival pieces over the next year. So let's look at these open-worked, thank God there are many of them, bulbous trefoil spandrels here. That is more hideous than anything that ever would have really existed during the late Gothic period. And we can see that it's much more of a funny exaggeration than it is a copy of anything that ever existed in the original Gothic decorative vocabulary. To that point, this is in general a luxury that the late medieval period would have, of course, never known. They definitely didn't have access to Brazilian rosewood in the 1300s, the 1400s, or the 1500s. Now, the chair is definitely winking at the bygone Gothic cathedra, these seigneurial chairs, which used to be in the bedrooms at the time. Bedrooms were also sort of reception areas. But this is a faint allusion to one of those, such that if you didn't already have one in mind, you might miss the point. Here's a picture of a somewhat reasonably genuine Gothic one that I sold to a Gothically inclined German man a few years ago before having the time to video it. At least the center panel of the back of that chair was from the High Gothic period. I had a few experts come and look at that. And those cathedra, or cathèdre in French, those were also called chairs, which is a word derived from the Latin cathedra, meaning seat. And we still use the word chair for chair today. Now, the fabric here is a period recreation, which is staged here, showing us how decorative art, which is seating, is just as much a work of sculpture and architecture as it is a frame to present this woven art. Also, the upholstery work and the purchase of the silk was always costlier at the time, back here in the 1830s, than was the cost of the original actual piece of furniture, just so you know, per that point that the upholstery is just as artistically relevant as the chair itself. Now this perfect yellow, if I dare to have an opinion, with these grayish motifs of ivy, I would have been hard-pressed to cover this chair with anything more successful than what I happen to randomly have in my closet, very opportunistically. The pattern, medieval ivy, it's a romantic plant symbolizing holding on to something. It's very nostalgic. It enhances the Gothicness of the chair. It dialogues with this style and it brings out the style. And then the warmth of the color dialogues with the warmth of the metal ornamentation, while also brightening the chair in general and keeping it from lapsing over into something a little more Dracula, which I don't think we want. But we can see how that could easily happen with such a dark object. Now, when we carefully lay this artifact down, we will see that this particular chair conserves a very precious and stupendously rare label of the original upholsterer, which says Mercier, tapissier et marchand de meubles, an upholsterer and a merchant of furniture. Those people should be avoided. Anyway, it's extremely rare to have a label like that, and we can also see the two Jeanselme ink stamps here inside of the frame of the chair. Jeanselme apparently signed quite a few of their pieces, but not all of them. This was certainly made after the 1791 abolition of the law which mandated that you sign pieces for tax and quality control reasons. So not all the pieces of this period are going to be signed. In fact, relatively few of them are. But it does seem that makers would sign their best pieces. That appears to be the case here because we have two. This webbing is original, and if I had to guess, the springs within the chair, which we're not going to cut into and check them out, but the springs are probably original and they have been retied with new threads. Springs emerge historically around 1834, and then their use standardizes throughout the 1840s. So this chair likely was born with springs. I bet you they are still inside. Always keep some syringes with you. What I'm going to do to deal with these woodworms is take this syringe, this medical device, and I am going to administer a treatment to these worms, which will send them straight to hell. Very toxic chemical is going to go down in there, the wood's going to drink it up, and the worms are going to die. Okay, so to discuss the work of the Jeanselme firm, this is going to be an important thing to not mess up. Damn, I can see why people don't deal in furniture. Anyway, we can discuss the Jeanselme firm thanks to a 12-page, very exceptionally long entry in Denise Ledouxlabard's landmark Dictionary of 19th century furniture makers. So the firm was founded in 1824 by two brothers, Jean Arnoux and Joseph Pierre François. And they specialized in chairs and armchairs. And by the 1830s, they became the leading manufacturer of this type of fine furniture, of chairs, in Paris. They also made various royal deliveries, such as these two sofas, which are still in place in the family salon of King Louis-Philippe at Grand Trianon, which is at Versailles. It's another chateau on the Palace of Versailles grounds. Now, Jeanselme also delivered various pieces to Louis-Philippe's different decoration campaigns, such as those of Saint-Cloud, Le Château d'Eu, and Le Château de Pau in the south of France. Jeanselme also delivered pieces to the Garde-Meuble de la Couronne, the National Furniture Reserve, the Crown's furniture repository, That's an institution which was founded a couple centuries earlier under King Louis XIV and which still operates today under the name Mobilier National, National Furniture. It still conserves 319 works by Jeanselme. Now, on the topic of Jeanselme being an official furnisher to King Louis-Philippe, I should mention that Gothic revival emerged in England in the 1750s, and it was always more of an English flavor, but it took off during this period, the 1830s and 40s in France, in part because King Louis-Philippe himself had acquired the English taste for the Gothic during his many years spent in exile in England. Anyway, Jeanselme's importance only grows during the subsequent Napoleon III period, where he enjoyed success at the world's fairs. Le Doulabard's dictionary cites a report from the 1855 World's Fair here in Paris, which said that Jeanselme's pieces are excellent. He is a self-made man owing everything to integrity and to hard work. He knows how to retain and employs 300 of the city's best artisans. The dictionary also mentions Jeanselme's collaborations with various important designers such as Léonard, also his competition at the time with Grouet, and she also mentions his further imperial royal commissions delivered to the Château de Fontainebleau, the Palais Royal here in Paris, and Compiègne. The 300 artisans thing is probably the most important detail to retain of everything I just rattled off, because that makes us question how much of this beautiful, artistic, museum quality chair was actually made by a Jeanselme. I'm going to say somewhere in the neighborhood of 0%. This was a company, it was a brand. The Jeanselmes themselves, whose name is stamped underneath the chair, it seems that they were running a business. Their workshop is what made this. Certainly they oversaw the designs and they handled all sorts of business things. I bet you they had an enormous culture and could make a chair, but by the time this was made, and I think we need to remember that these works of Parisian decorative art, they don't have much to do with this idea, beautiful but fictitious, of the lone furniture maker sculpting something like this out by candlelight. He had 300 employees. And to jump around and make this presentation even more confusing, one of the Jeanselme chairs which was delivered to the Royal Château de Pau in 1841 helps us to date this chair, because that chair presents almost exactly the same Neo-Renaissance top. It has the same cartouche, which in its case is sculpted with an H, alluding no doubt to Henry IV. Here we see, however, inside of this cartouche, that we have a personal monogram of someone, H.A., underneath the crown of a marquis, a marquis. We can see with that 1841 chair with the same top that the rest of the chair has become very neo-1600, neo-Henry IV. So if we consider that this is an 1841 element, and the rest of the chair is very 1830 to 35 in its primary materials, rosewood and inlays, that helps us kind of come up with an average of dating this chair to the late 1830s. The idea is 1835, the top is apparently 1841, so that's how we end up giving an 1835 to 1840 dating to the chair. Even though Denise Le Doulabard actually writes that the Jeanselme ink stamp was only used after 1840, I'm not sure that she saw absolutely every Jeanselme chair. I think this was probably made in 1836, 7, 9, something around there. And by the time we see the exact top appearing on an 1841 chair, the design of the chair in 1841 is no longer Charles X rosewood and neo-Gothic. It's totally, totally different. So I feel fairly secure in dating this to the late 1830s. Emerging from that rabbit hole, let's just practically point out how interesting it is that these finials, the rosewood finials here, are turned oppositely, both designed to spiral inwards. That's a nice touch. They didn't just turn them exactly the same and plant them there. Now, the monogram up here under this aristocratic crown helps us to confront the stereotype that these pastiche and revival-driven later works in the traditional timeline of decorative art, that they were of bourgeois or cheaper or lesser tastes. Normally, we kind of have good reason to disparage later works of furniture because of industrialization that's occurring at this time, increasing the volume and diminishing the quality of so many decorative objects for the home. Nevertheless, it is still interesting to discern between more everyday works that become more readily available and the finer luxury works of art which were still being made at this early industrial time. And clearly this custom-made chair, although it is in this pastiche and revival, it clearly suited the tastes of someone in the high aristocracy. Thinkers in the decorative arts today have to be very careful before liking anything that was made this late. However, there were gems like this being made, and even if the style is a marked departure from the purity and the elegance of the previous styles associated with the aristocracy, it wasn't just something for people of simple, lower tastes. Absolutely, the height of French society was apparently buying this obnoxious chair. So that helps us to understand the social context of who would have first owned this, and it helps us to dismiss some of the snobbery towards pieces from this time as somehow not being elite enough. They were very elite. And in fact, they're very non-representative of what furniture was like at the time. This is a gem that has managed to come through to us today. I'm sure that furniture that represents what most people had, it was thrown away. So examples of more prototypical and neoclassical Jeanselme work are conserved in various museums worldwide. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London conserves this 1851 chair presented at the World's Fair, the Great Exhibition. It was made on an 1834 design, however, by Pelagio Pelaghi, an Italian designer who designed these beautiful pieces for the King of Sardinia, delivered in 1842, I believe, and now they are on display in the Met, in Detroit, and in the Getty. But anyway, in addition to that Jeanselme chair, 1851 but designed in 1834 in the V&A, we can see a pair of quintessentially 1820s light-colored chairs in Philadelphia's Museum of Art. Those are actually out on display near some chairs in light-colored wood from the same period from the McKillany collection by Jean-Jacques Werner, another maker that we've discussed in other videos. We've taken a look at some Werner chairs. I didn't intend for that to rhyme with Werner. And then I had a little pair of side chairs in rosewood like this. Those were signed Jeanselme. Those sold a little while ago. And then we looked at a set of 4 armchairs, which I attributed to Jeanselme because I saw in the hands of another dealer a very large set of exactly those chairs, which were signed. Mine were not. Anyway, those are all neoclassical examples of his work, much more typical. This is an anti-classical Troubadour chair, reviving in part the Gothic, so it's a totally different flavor. And in an upcoming video, we're actually going to be looking at some of the physical pieces which were drawn in an ébénisterie manual, a furniture maker's manual of 1835, which was one of the documents I used to help situate the dating of this chair, 1835 to 40. We can look at Caron-Laîné's manual and we see a chair that is not an armchair, but it's reminiscent of what we see going on here. So you haven't seen the end of this type of furniture. Anyway, to give a little bit of historical context after all of this, by the 1893 World's Fair, Jeanselme acquires the Lemarchand family furniture-making firm. Thus, in addition to the 1847 acquisition of the Jacob family firm, Jeanselme absorbs the 2 largest French furniture workshops of the 19th century. Lemarchand made, for instance, Napoleon's coffin. It was an important company. The one Lemarchand piece we've looked at on the channel was actually also in this interesting gilded bronze and rosewood variety of 1835 furniture. It was this console étagère. And then we looked at another piece of this very rare type of furniture from the 1830s, which was this beautiful transforming mechanical desk made for the precursors of the World's Fairs. It was exhibited at the 1834 Paris exhibition and made by Jean-Christophe Fischer. Jean-Christophe Fischer and Jeanselme both won silver medals for their exhibitions at that 1834 Paris exhibition. So it's interesting to see how a lot of these figures in furniture history are so adjacent to one another. In fact, we looked at a Charles X commode made by, or at least stamped by, Antoine Nicolas Lesage in a previous video. And Lesage was more of a merchant, but Le Doulebard recounts in her dictionary that Jeanselme actually had pieces for sale at Lesage's opulent store near the opera. Regarding that fancy desk, if anyone is ever in Kansas City, please do head by Gallery P26 in the Nelson Atkins. You might enjoy being able to see that piece, as well as another piece that we covered on the channel in this very room, which is now on display there. It's an 1851 desk by Angelo Barbetti. It's an Italian piece for a Russian prince. And of course it rolls. This was modern comfort. It was not a desk chair. Could have been a desk chair, but the rollers are just a way to help move this heavy chair. So Jeanselme closed in 1930, just 5 years before my grandmother was born. I had her on the phone the other day. So it really wasn't that long ago. It's interesting how these transcendentalist things really broaden your own experience of time. And with that being said, I do hope, as usual, that these videos have been a nice reprieve for some of you from the quiet desperation of life, and that the information, the incomplete information that I tried to convey, will help you, as it has helped me, to recognize antiques that are art, as opposed to antiques that are just antiques.